This is the first part of the lecture on phonology. And we actually saw and we decoded this slide in the previous class. It contains a number of sentences that are written in the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA. And what makes the IPA different from most other alphabets, and what makes it quite useful, is the fact that each symbol that you see here, each symbol in the IPA, represents one and only one sound. So this symbol here represents only the D sound and no other sound. This one, the O sound and no other sound. And this one, the G sound and no other sound. And so we can read this word, dog. Now, contrast that with D-O-G, which is just the typical English spelling of the same word. And that could be read in any number of different ways, depending on your dialect of English or what part of the English-speaking world you hail from. D-O-G, if you're from Brooklyn, could be pronounced dog. If you're from the Deep South, dog. If you're from the Midwest, dog. So D-O-G can be pronounced any number of ways. This, however, this, and this can only be pronounced one way, dog. If I wanted to transcribe dog into IPA or dog into IPA, it would look different from this. It would look the same in the regular English alphabet, but different in IPA. So in this unit on phonology, we're going to look at the sound, and more precisely we're going to look at recognizable sounds. This is an example. The N sound is recognizable by all speakers of English and even speakers of French. Now that has to be stored somewhere in the brain, of course, but what is really interesting and what we're going to explore in this unit is that how this sound is stored in the brain, how it's recognized, how we try to produce it, isn't always the same as the way we actually speak the sound. How we store sounds in the brain and how they sound, given the physical constraints of the vocal tract, are not necessarily identical. A particular sound might vary slightly depending on the sounds around it, its position within a word, syllable, etc. Now what does this mean? It means simply that the way an English speaker understands N, the way it's stored in your brain, they're going to try and produce that N as they understand it, but it's not always going to come out sounding the same. It's not always going to come out sounding the way that it was stored in the brain. Let me give you a couple of examples here. If you were to ask these three questions to your average English speaker, you're likely to get answers that are quite incorrect. In other words, if you ask an average English speaker, is the N or N sound in skin and skiing, are those two sounds identical? Most English speakers, without really thinking about it, will say, yes, those are the same sounds. Those are both N sounds and they're identical. If you ask them, how about the T in bet and better, again, you're likely to get the same answer. Yes, those two sounds, those two T sounds are identical. How about the E in seep and see? Again, you'll get the same answer. Yes, those are identical sounds. Well, in fact, that's not true. The N in skin is produced by placing the tip of the tongue right behind the teeth on the alveolar ridge, and you get the N sound. The N in skiing is produced quite differently. It is produced by placing the back of the tongue on the back of the mouth, and you get a Ng sound. And so these two sounds aren't the same sound at all, even though most English speakers recognize them as such. They would actually have different IPA symbols because they're different sounds, but in the mind they would have that sort of representation, one single representation. How about the T in bet and better? Well, if you say that word a couple of times, you'll start to hear that this T sounds a little bit more like a D than a T, even though it's recognized as a T. Same thing here. This E in seep and C, it's not identical. E in seep is said very quickly, whereas the E in C is said a little bit more slowly. It's drawn out a little bit longer. So you get seep, that's a quick E, and you get C, which is a slow or a drawn out E. It's a lengthened E. And so our study of phonology is basically going to look at these types of variations with one fundamental question in mind, and that question is, which sound variations do we actually notice? Why is it that we don't notice the difference between the E in seep and C? And how does that differ from other sounds, which we do notice? We notice that a N sound is completely different from a T sound. We'll never confuse those. However, we will tend to confuse the E in seep and C. We will tend to confuse the N in skin and skiing. But we don't confuse other sounds. So why is that? Here's another example of sounds that we tend to confuse with one another. This P in pit is not the same as this P in spit. Actually, they're quite different sounds. If you say these two words a couple of times, perhaps you can start to begin to hear the difference. I'd like for you to push pause, actually, if you can, and try pronouncing these words and see if you can start to hear the difference between the P's. The P's in these pairs of words sound quite different from another. This P is not the same as this P. This P is not the same as this P. This P is not the same as this P. So try to pronounce these pairs of words and see if you can start to understand and hear the difference and recognize the difference between these various P's.